So we're really looking forward to celebrating on June 3rd the feast of the patron saints of our apostolate, St. Carlos Lwanga and his companions. These are 22 young African men who died in the 1880s in what's now the nation of Uganda. They were in various ways in the service of the king. In those days, the nation was called Buganda, and King Mwanga II was on the throne. He himself was just a young man, and some of the martyrs are actually a few years older than him. The young men who went on to be saints, they were baptized and instructed by some French priests who had come to the kingdom during the previous king's reign, and they weren't allowed to just preach anywhere, but they were allowed to talk to those who worked in the palace and in the army and who were close to the king. So for a while there was a rather tense relationship between King Mwanga and these French missionaries. He expelled them from his kingdom several times. And then towards the middle of 1885, things really became very difficult for the Catholics and for all the Christians in the king's court. The priests were sent away yet again, and the king's majordomo, the kind of overseer of his palace, was a man named Joseph Balakudembe. He was very wise, very mature. I think he was probably late 30s, early 40s. He had served the king's father, but the young king didn't always get along with Joseph. There was an Anglican bishop who was coming to evangelize, and he didn't seek the permission of the king before crossing the frontier. So King Mwanga sent soldiers out, and they killed him in the wilderness. When Joseph rebuked the king for this as having committed a grave sin, the king was enraged and ordered that Joseph be killed. And he was killed in the most brutal way. I mean, he was hacked to death. His limbs were cut off one at a time, and then he was left by the side of the road until he died. So that was November of 1885, and the next few months just got increasingly tense for the missionaries and for the young Catholics in the king's court. Many of the boys in the king's court, both the Catholics and the unbaptized boys, would be invited by the king, who was about 19 years old, to spend time with him alone, and oftentimes he would seduce the boys, some of whom were as young as 13 or 14, into homosexual intimate acts with himself and with other members of his court. Joseph had known that this was happening, and so he couldn't stop the king completely, but he could keep the boys away from him as much as possible. And so the king got increasingly jealous of the Catholics, especially, who were protecting the boys from him and from these sinful ideas that he had. In May of 1886, the king and some of his courtiers went hunting, and their servants expected them to be away for several days. The king was hippopotamus hunting, actually, and there weren't any animals to be found, and so he came back early, later that same day, and was already annoyed, and then was furious when he found that all of his servants had gone out for the day. When one of his servants, a young man named Dennis Sebugwayo, came back with another one of the king's servants who was not baptized and had really was the favorite of the king. The king asked Dennis, "Where have you been?" And he said, "Well, we went to see the priests." And so the king very jealously said, "You're going to take all of them away from me." He flew into a rage, took a spear, and pinned Dennis to the wall with it. Dennis, I think, was about 16 or 17 years old. And so he killed him right there in the middle of the court, then called everyone in, all of his servants, and said, "All those who pray, stand on one side." So the Catholics, as well as some who had been baptized in the Anglican Church, stood aside. The king threatened them if they didn't give up their religion, that they would soon be killed. They all stood fast. He threw them in prison for the night, and about half of them were baptized that night. They had been receiving instructions, but were baptized by Carlos Lwanga, who was the head catechist after Joseph had died. They were baptized in prison, and then the next day they were marched 12 miles to a place called Namagongo, which was the place of execution. Along the way, each time they came to a major crossroads, one of them was executed at the crossroads and left there as an example to others. So the servants were marched to the place of execution. They were kept in prison there for about a week. And then on June 3rd, about half of the 22 that we celebrate as Catholic martyrs were put to death there by being burned alive. St. Charles was burned first by himself to frighten and intimidate the others. They burned his body a little bit at a time, which caused great agony. But he didn't renounce the faith. He called out to God and asked God to forgive his executioners. And then the others that were killed at Namagongo were burned alive on one great pyre that was set alight and killed them, and about a dozen Anglican martyrs as well. Some of the other martyrs, those who were older and were in the king's army or were regional governors, the king sent soldiers to kill them near their homes, and they were either killed by swords or spears, or some of them clubbed to death. They set dogs on St. Luke Benevakintu, but just killed in terrible, horrible ways. So they are the first modern martyrs of Africa, although in Roman times there were many martyrs, especially in places like Carthage and Tunisia and northern Africa. And so they were canonized by Pope Paul VI in 1963, and he went on a pilgrimage to Namagongo the following year. And so we observe their feast day on June the 3rd, which is actually also the ordination anniversary of our founding director, Father Harvey. We have a beautiful shrine in the chapel in the Courage office, and relics that were a gift to the office of St. Charles and St. Matthias Mulumba. They were the only two whose bodies could be identified. But we have relics of their bodies and a place to pray and ask for their intercession each day, and we do invoke them in all of our prayers here at the office and each time that we gather for daily Mass.